Hi, I'm playing the role of Jane in this video. Let's take a look at how to sync data from a database table to a Cinchy table. I'll be working with a SQL database. However, there are several different types of databases that are supported. Here's the SQL table that I'll be using to sync into Cinchy, customer contacts. There are 10 records for 89 Corporation that will be synced from the SQL table into the Cinchy contacts table. Let's have a look at the target table in Cinchy. We can see here that 89 Corporation does not exist in the contacts table in Cinchy currently. Let's take a look at how the sync has been configured to get the data from the SQL table into the Cinchy table. There are 3 sections that we will review in the sync before we run the job. The info section, this holds the details for the sync such as the name, the version, and any parameters that you'll be using within the sync. The source, this outlines the columns that are in the source, in this example, the columns from the SQL table, and the destination. This is where all of the columns from the source will be mapped into the target. For this sync, we have identified the name and the version. Let's pop into the source and see how it was set up for this specific sync. The source has been identified as MS SQL Server since we're syncing from a SQL table to a Cinchy table. Here we can see the connection string. It is already encrypted for us. Let's take a look at what's required to set up the connection string. In the server field, here's where you would identify the name or the unique IP address for the SQL server you are trying to connect to, the name of the database, the user executing, and their password. Please note that when you are entering in the connection string in the window, the values will not be encrypted. The encryption occurs when you click the Update button. It is also important to note that if you wish to edit the connection string, the original connection string parameters will not be visible when you click the Edit button. This is for security reasons. Next, you need to identify the object. It is a table or a query. In this example, we'll be pulling from a table, not a query. Next, you'll need to provide the name of the table you are syncing from. We can see here that the sync from the SQL table is already populated. You always have the ability to create the schema manually by adding one column at a time. However, you also have the ability to load the schema directly into the UI by loading the metadata into the sync configuration. We can see here the columns from the SQL table have been identified in the sync configuration schema. Now let's have a look at how the mappings between the SQL table and the Cinchy table have been set up. The table domain has been identified, along with the table name, and also suppress duplicate errors has been selected. Note differently, when setting up the source columns, we have the ability to load the metadata into the sync configuration for the destination columns as well. The same has been done here for the Cinchy table. Let's have a look at a few of the mappings between the source and destination that have been completed. Company ID has been mapped to corporate ID. For company name, it's been mapped to company. Since the company column in Cinchy is a linked column, the linked column field has to be mapped as well. This is done so that Cinchy can resolve the data as it's being synced into a linked column. If you're unsure of what this value is, you can always validate by looking at how the specific columns have been set up in Cinchy. Great, now that we've had a chance to look at the mapping, we're going to look at a few additional things like the sync key reference column and the behaviors for the new, changed, and deleted records. The sync key column reference is the reference to the primary column, the column that is unique for this data set. Finally, we need to identify the intended behaviors for when data is being synced. The intended behavior for a net new record being synced into the target, the intended behavior for a record that exists in the target but does not exist in the source, and finally, the intended behavior for a record that exists within the target. Let's run the job now. I can see here Cinchy is asking me to save the sync configuration. It has detected that a change has been made and not yet saved. I'll go ahead and save it now. I'm using a user called SQL to run the sync. I have created service accounts in Cinchy as these accounts will allow for traceability. Time to run the job. Perfect. I can see here that the sync was successful. And 10 records have been processed, and 10 records were created. Let's pop back into the Cinchy table to validate that the data has been loaded. Here are the records we just synced into Cinchy. I can see that all 10 records for the client name 89 Corporation are here. Since the contact table has change approvals enabled, I will need to go ahead and approve the records that have just been synced in. I'll do that now. Great, they're all approved. Since the SQL Service Account user was used to execute the sync, when we go into the collaboration log, we'll be able to see that the sync was completed by the SQL account and approved by Jane's account.